I can still feel his eyelashes brushing against my wrist, a light, almost weightless signal that decided everything. 2 blinks. Yes. I knew my father no longer wanted to live in that body, where every breath was pain and every minute was torment. I did what he asked me to do. But when the screen went dark and the silence grew too loud, I realized the world would never believe in 2 blinks, especially if you're his daughter. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Sarah Miller. I was 34, and I worked as a registered nurse in the emergency department of a hospital on the outskirts of Baltimore, Maryland. My badge had a chip that opened doors with a soft, obedient click, and for years I believed in the order that sound promised. I believed in shift notes, barcodes, sterile fields, and the way an IV cath found its vein with a sure, practiced push. I believed in the rhythm of a place where machines sang their thin metallic lullabies and people returned from edges because a team had rehearsed the choreography of rescue so often that even exhaustion moved gracefully. I believed in the ordinary mercy of routine, the way it quelled panic and refined purpose. I woke before the sun, tied my hair in the same tight knot, ate the same oatmeal from a chipped bowl with a blue ring burned into the glaze, and drove the same route along the harbor where gulls scissored the air and the water carried the quiet of ships that had left long before I was born. I lived in a second-floor apartment above a bakery that started kneading dough at 3 a.m. The smell of yeast rose through the vents and turned the narrow hallway into a warm throat-breathing sugar and flour. My landlord kept a plastic fern in the stairwell that fooled no one, and on winter mornings the radiators ticked like small clocks hidden in metal ribs. I kept my life trimmed to what could be carried up and down those stairs: a mattress on a simple frame, a scarred pine table, 3 mugs, 4 plates, a second-hand bookshelf, and a plant that forgave me for forgetting to water it. Every night I folded my scrubs into a neat square as if the gesture could shrink the day. I broke my life into squares wherever I could: schedules, pillboxes, lists. There was comfort in a grid. If I could locate the edges, the middle would hold. I knew the hospital by sound long before I could see its brick and glass across the parking lot. The double beat of the ambulance bay door, the pneumatic sigh of negative pressure rooms, the mouse-quiet wheels of the crash cart that moved like intention toward need. I could tell the difference between the cough of a smoker and the gasping plea of an airway closing, between the rattled whisper of a high fever and the sharp gulp of someone discovering pain where there had been none. I belonged to a species of people who pinched the bridge of their nose when they had a headache and still charted in complete sentences. Coffee lived in my bloodstream like a second, browner oxygen. My hands had a memory that anticipated the weight of gauze, the damp of chlorhexidine, the soft resistance of skin when you tape it clean and smooth so it will not lift. It was a language I spoke without words, a grammar of pressure and release. On my days off, the apartment was too quiet. The bakery downstairs did not work late, and the street calmed after the last bus. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the traffic signal outside, switching colors for no one. It was in those margins that my thoughts slowed enough to break apart, and I would go for a run along the water, or read until the page dissolved into a whiteness that reminded me of hospital sheets. I collected small rituals that tethered me to the simplest version of myself. I kept a stack of postcards in the drawer, not for sending, but for their images: a lighthouse in Maine, a painted desert, a field of wheat like a gold pelt. They were flat windows I could lift when the walls of my life pressed too close. I cooked on Sundays, big pots of soup that could be stretched across a week, divided and labeled in the freezer with dates written in neat block letters. I slept with the window cracked even in December because I needed proof that the air could still move on its own. My father lived 2 miles away in a long-term care facility whose hallways smelled like lemon disinfectant and afternoon television. He used to be a firefighter, and the city gave him a plaque the year he retired. It was heavy and square, and lived in a box under his bed in the apartment where he had not slept for a long time. The facility had a courtyard with 3 young maples and a robin that nested every spring in the gutter above the laundry room. I visited on the way home from night shifts when the sun backed up against the horizon like a tired truck, and the light was thin enough to see the dust float in blue streaks over the nurse's station. I carried the bakery's still warm rolls in my bag and the day's weariness in my shoulders, and I sat in a chair with a missing rubber foot that rocked a little as if it remembered a porch it had never known. I had learned to measure time there differently, not by hours or days, but by the slow shaving of capacities. First came the names, the way they slid off into water and could not be pulled back easily without tearing. Then the ways of walking, spooning, buttoning, turning a page. We surrendered each thing carefully, as if holding a ceremony around a loss could keep it from being theft. I kept notebooks of everything that could be counted: blood pressure, oxygen saturation, medication times, because counting was a religion that had always kept me from falling apart. I organized his drawers the way I triaged a pileup, attending to the most urgent, then the next, building order out of the chaos of laundry. It didn't happen all at once. People like to imagine there's some sharp moment, a clean tear in the fabric of ordinary life, a thunderclap that announces that something irreversible is about to unfold. But in my case, it came quietly, like the sound of water rising in a sink when you've left the tap on just a little too long. One moment, you don't notice it. The next, your feet are wet, and it's already too late to stop the flood. The hospital room had the kind of stillness that wasn't peaceful. It was mechanical, artificial. The machines breathed for him, blinked for him, hummed the lullaby of suspended life that I both clung to and hated. The air smelled like bleach and plastic and something else that no cleaning agent could mask. Despair, maybe. Or maybe it was just the absence of something. The absence of choice. My father had been paralyzed from the neck down for almost a year by then. A car crash had crumpled his body like paper, shattered bones, severed nerves, stolen his voice, his hands, his ability to even swallow without assistance. But it hadn't taken his eyes. That was the only part of him the accident had left untouched. His gaze remained piercing, deliberate, alive. Through blinking, we had created a system: 1 blink for no, 2 for yes. It had begun as a survival tool, a way for him to express needs: pain, thirst, too cold, too hot. Then it evolved into something else, his last form of agency. For months, I lived between my job and his bedside, sleeping in my car or on the cot near the window, waking to the hiss of oxygen, the low alarms that meant nothing, everything. Nurses came and went. Most didn't speak to him like he was fully there. They looked at his chart, not his face. But I looked. I learned to read every micro-expression, the smallest dilation in his pupils, the tremor just above his cheek. Sometimes I swore I could hear him, even though I knew I couldn't. The question was first asked in a moment of exhaustion, not his, mine. I had been up for 3 days, running on vending machine coffee and guilt, trying to balance the hospital with work, with bills that kept stacking higher, no matter how many times I told the insurance company the word catastrophic. I leaned over him and whispered, almost absently, like someone talking to themselves in a dream. Do you still want to fight? He blinked once, then again. I froze. 2 blinks. Yes. No. No. I had made a mistake. Maybe I hadn't asked it clearly. I rephrased. Do you want to keep going? 1 blink. No. I felt the ground tilt beneath me. The sounds in the room became louder. The ventilator's wheeze, the heart monitor's slow rhythm, the fluorescent lights buzzing above. I gripped the side of the bed. My palms were sweating. I told myself it was fatigue, miscommunication. But when I asked again, taking a deep breath, making sure my voice was steady, he gave the same answer. 1 blink. No. He didn't want to go on. I started crying, not from shock, but from recognition. I had seen it in his eyes long before he said it, in the way he stared out the window for hours, not focusing on anything, in the tightening of his eyelids when we spoke about another surgery, another treatment, another maybe. I had felt it in my bones but hadn't wanted to name it. Over the next few days, I asked again, and again. I changed the phrasing. I waited until morning, then night, then midday. I didn't want him to say yes out of pain or confusion or momentary despair. But he never wavered. Every time I asked if he wanted me to let him go, he blinked twice. Yes, yes, yes. I began researching, like any good daughter would. I looked up advance directives, living wills, palliative sedation, hospice policies, but none of it applied. He had no prior documentation. The accident had come too suddenly, and because he was technically nonverbal and couldn't sign, his wishes didn't matter in the eyes of the law. Blinking wasn't enough. His eyes weren't evidence. I talked to his doctor carefully. I asked about quality of life, about prognosis, about pain. He answered in the measured tone of someone who had said these things 1,000 times to 1,000 grieving families. There were no improvements expected, only decline, infections, bed sores, organ failure. Eventually, the machines would do everything except think for him, and even that, over time, might degrade. I didn't sleep after that. I watched him through the night, waiting for him to blink again, to change his mind. But he didn't. His gaze was clear. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting for me to be brave. And so I decided, not all at once, not heroically, but gradually, like someone walking barefoot into snow, 1 step at a time, knowing it will burn and freeze all at once. I chose a day. It was warm outside, unusually so for spring. I remember the light through the blinds painting stripes across his blanket. I told the nurses I would stay with him alone for a while. They nodded, busy, distracted. I had done it before. There was no reason to suspect. He looked at me, already knowing. There was a stillness in him that made me feel small, like a child about to steal from a sacred place. My hands trembled as I touched the tubing. I didn't move quickly. I asked him again, just once more. Are you ready? 2 blinks. Yes. I kissed his forehead. I pressed my fingers against the switch. The machine exhaled one final time and fell silent. The room didn't scream. It didn't collapse. There was only the quiet. His face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. His eyes slowly closed, not forced shut by paralysis, but gently, like the body letting go of itself. I held his hand until the warmth left it, and then I sat back in the chair and waited. For the nurses, for the doctors, for the sound of footsteps that would lead me into the next version of my life, one I hadn't chosen, one I had created with my own hands. The line had been crossed, not in violence, not in rage, but in love, in mercy, in silence, in a language no court would ever accept. And I already knew I would pay for it. There's a particular kind of silence that settles in just after you've confessed to something unthinkable. It doesn't feel like relief. It doesn't feel like peace. It feels like the moment before a wave crashes, suspended, full of invisible weight, and then nothing but the echo of your own breath to anchor you. After I told them what I'd done, time didn't move forward. It scattered. Some hours lasted days. Others blinked past in a blur. I was fingerprinted under cold, buzzing lights that made my skin look gray. They asked me to remove my necklace, my watch, the rubber band from my wrist. It felt like they were stripping away everything that had belonged to the woman who had existed up until that moment. All that was left was the shape of someone else, someone who had done something irrevocable. The holding cell smelled of metal and old plastic. I sat on a bench that was too short to stretch out on, too narrow to sit on comfortably. My shoulders curled in. I don't know how long I sat like that, curved like a comma in a sentence that had no end. They gave me a paper cup of water. I didn't drink it. Eventually, someone said my name. Not Sarah, not Miss Miller, just Miller. It sounded clinical, like I was already a case file. I followed them down a hallway of sickly green tiles and buzzing fluorescent lights into an interrogation room that looked exactly like they do in television shows, only smaller, cheaper, more stained. I answered their questions with the truth. I didn't know how to do anything else. When they asked why I did it, I said he asked me to. When they asked how he asked, I said with his eyes. When they asked again, pressing harder, their tone sharpening, I said it again. 2 blinks for yes. Their faces were blank. One of them sighed. Another scribbled. One left the room. The door closed behind him like the sound of a book being slammed shut. I was charged with second-degree murder 2 days later. They didn't even pretend to consider a lesser charge. There was no written consent, no audio, no legal form, just my word against a dead man's silence. And dead men can't testify. I remember the courtroom like I remember my father's hospital room, clinical, precise, cruel in its structure. The chairs were wooden and too upright. The lighting was too bright, too harsh. The judge barely looked at me. The prosecutor did. He had eyes that glinted like polished stone and a voice that never rose above polite condemnation. He called it premeditated. He called it selfish. He called it murder. The trial hadn't even started, and the world had already decided I was guilty. They placed me in county jail while I waited for my arraignment. I had never been in any kind of cell before. The first time the steel door clanked shut behind me, I felt something inside me shudder, not with fear, not yet, but with the surreal understanding that I was no longer in control of where my body could go. My space was 6 feet by 9, a cot, a toilet, a sink. I had no mirror. I couldn't see myself anymore. The women around me were loud, profane, too tired to be curious. They looked at me like I didn't belong. I suppose I didn't. Not yet. I kept my head down, didn't speak unless spoken to. I tried to disappear into the cinder block walls, into the beige of my uniform, into the noise of other people's misery. I folded myself into the shape of someone forgettable. It didn't work. People talk. Rumors spread. The other women started calling me Angel of Death behind my back, not out of cruelty, but out of some strange reverence. They thought I was brave. Some thought I was dangerous. One woman told me she would have done the same if someone had asked her to end it. Another said I'd burn in hell. The guards didn't speak to me much at all. Sleep was a knife that only sliced in slivers. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the machines again, saw the stillness, the last blink, the soundless goodbye. I dreamed of wires and switches and sterile light. I dreamed of my father's eyes, blinking endlessly into darkness. Then came the hearings, the attorneys with their folders and voices soaked in strategy. My court-appointed lawyer was kind but overwhelmed. She told me not to speak, then asked me to speak, then asked me to stop speaking again. The judge sat above us like a statue carved from granite. He didn't blink at all. Each time I entered the courtroom, shackled, I scanned the seats for someone familiar. I hoped for a friend, a colleague, someone from the hospital who would speak for me. No one came. It was as if, the moment my story was spoken aloud, it became contagious. People disappeared. Even those who once called themselves my friends kept their distance. Grief is one thing, choice is another. I had made a choice, and it had frightened them. I began to feel the weight of time not in hours, but in the way the light shifted through the tiny window above my bed. The sun came in thin slices and left in thicker ones. I marked time in meals, in the shift changes of the guards, in the number of times my cellmate coughed in her sleep. That's when the walls began to move, not literally, but perceptibly. They started pressing inward, like they were inhaling, growing fuller with each passing hour. The ceiling hung heavier. The corners seemed to curve. I felt like I was living inside a lung about to collapse. My body adjusted in ways I didn't want it to. My voice became quieter, my back more hunched, my footsteps slower, deliberate. I learned the patterns of others, when to move, when to wait, how to ask for something without sounding like I was asking. I memorized the guard rotation, the sound of keys, the rhythm of locked doors. I learned how to disappear in plain sight, but my mind didn't quiet. It kept replaying everything. The sound of his machine shutting down, the last breath that wasn't really a breath, the feeling of his skin cooling beneath my hand, the blinks, always the blinks. I wasn't haunted by the act. I was haunted by how easily I was now being recast. Not as a daughter, not even as a caregiver, but as a killer. I started writing letters I didn't send. To my father, to the judge, to anyone who might someday want to hear the story from my side. I wrote on scraps of paper with a dull pencil. I wrote at night when the others snored. The words weren't elegant. They were raw, torn from the place behind my ribs where language had turned to fire. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the lead broke, until my own breath startled me in the dark. This was how I survived the walls moving, not by pushing them back, but by creating small, invisible spaces inside myself where I could still breathe. And I knew it was only the beginning. The trial hadn't even begun. The verdict was still waiting, but the sentence had already started. The first day of the trial began with a sound that felt foreign to me, the sharp, decisive strike of a gavel that declared I was no longer a person, but a case. It echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot muffled by marble. I sat there, hands folded, wrists heavy with invisible weight. The air smelled of old wood and paper, a scent that belonged to history, not to human pain. My name was called, not like an introduction, but like a label being peeled off a box. I was Sarah Miller, 34 years old, former nurse, daughter, defendant. The words barely seemed to belong to me anymore. The courtroom was smaller than I imagined it would be. The windows were narrow, the light filtered through like it was tired of trying to illuminate anything here. Every sound seemed amplified. The shuffle of shoes, the click of pens, the rustle of legal documents. I had imagined that a trial might bring clarity, that perhaps, once I explained myself, people would see what I had seen. But the truth was drowned before it even left my lips. This was not a trial about truth. It was a ritual, a performance of guilt dressed as justice. The prosecutor spoke first. His voice was smooth, deliberate, almost kind. That made it worse. He described me in words that felt like ashes in my mouth, cold, calculated, detached. He painted a picture of a woman who had taken life into her own hands as if it were a switch to be flipped, a mercy masked as control. He said I had no right to decide. He said love was not an excuse for murder. He said the law could not recognize a blink as consent. He said 2 blinks with a kind of condescension that made my stomach twist. The jury nodded, silent, trying to appear impartial. They didn't know that silence could be crueler than judgment. My lawyer sat beside me, her hands constantly moving over papers, highlighting, underlining, searching for something that wasn't there. She had tried to prepare me for this, had told me to keep my answers short, my tone respectful, my emotions contained. She said that tears made juries uncomfortable, that conviction came not just from facts, but from perception. I understood her, but I also knew that I was being asked to compress my entire world into sentences that could fit into a transcript. Every explanation sounded like an excuse. Every truth came out stripped of its pulse. When it was my turn to speak, the room changed. The air thickened. My throat closed up before I even began. The microphone in front of me hummed faintly, waiting. I talked about my father, about how he had been a firefighter, about how he'd saved people from burning buildings, how he'd always said that there were worse things than dying. I tried to describe the way his eyes moved, the way he had communicated with me. I tried to explain what it felt like to watch someone you love become trapped inside their own body. But as I spoke, I could see it, the invisible wall rising between me and them. My words floated, weightless, and fell before they reached anyone. The prosecutor objected often. He said my statements were emotional, irrelevant, speculative. The judge nodded. The stenographer typed. The jury listened but didn't hear. Every part of that room was designed to strip away feeling, to replace it with procedure. It was called justice, but it felt like surgery, clean, bloodless, and entirely detached from life. They brought in the doctors next, specialists, experts in neurology and medical ethics. They spoke in calm, precise language. They said there was no definitive way to prove intention through blinking. They said patients sometimes blink involuntarily, that reflexes could be misinterpreted. They said my father might have been disoriented, that his brain function was unpredictable. Each word from them chipped away at my memory, reshaping it into something else, something cold and uncertain. They spoke of my father as if he were data. I had lived his pain, but they had charts. The prosecutor showed photographs of the hospital room, the machines, the tubes, the bed where I had sat. He asked the jury to imagine what kind of person could walk into that room and make the decision I had made. He asked them to imagine what my father might have felt as the machines went quiet. He didn't mention the peace on his face. He didn't mention the relief in his eyes. Those were not facts. Those were feelings, and feelings have no place in court. When the defense called me again, my lawyer's voice trembled slightly. She asked if I believed I had done the right thing. I said I believed I had done what was asked of me. She asked if I loved my father. I said more than anything. She asked if I regretted it. I couldn't answer. Regret didn't fit into yes or no. Regret was too vast, too layered. It wasn't about wanting to undo what I did. It was about wanting the world to understand why I did it. But understanding wasn't part of the verdict. Each day of the trial bled into the next. The same faces, the same sequence of sounds, the scrape of the chairs when the jury entered, the clearing of throats, the clatter of my chains when I stood. I learned to breathe in rhythm with the court clerk's announcements. I learned to count time in objections and recesses. The courtroom became another kind of hospital room, sterile, endless, filled with machinery disguised as people. Outside, the media built a story around me. Headlines whispered of mercy killing, of euthanasia, of the blurred line between compassion and crime. They called me the blink killer. They called me the daughter who played God. I didn't read the papers, but I could feel their presence every time someone glanced at me like they already knew who I was. My life had become a symbol for something I didn't even believe in. On the final day, when both sides rested, the silence that filled the room felt almost physical. The jury's faces were unreadable, a mosaic of strangers who held my future in their hands. I wondered if any of them had ever watched someone die. I wondered if any of them had ever been asked to do the unthinkable out of love. I wondered if they understood that sometimes mercy looks like cruelty, that sometimes love wears the mask of death. The judge read the instructions. His voice was flat, practiced, stripped of any trace of humanity. When the jury left to deliberate, I sat still, staring at the empty witness stand, at the faint outline of the microphone where my voice had broken earlier. Hours passed like days. My lawyer tried to speak to me, but her words dissolved in the noise of my heartbeat. I felt suspended again, neither guilty nor innocent, just a person whose life had been translated into evidence. When the jury returned, they didn't look at me. None of them did. The foreperson stood, holding a piece of paper that decided everything. I remember his hands shaking slightly. He spoke in a monotone, the words barely audible over the hum in my ears. The verdict was read. I didn't move. I didn't cry. The prosecutor exhaled. The judge thanked the jury for their service. The bailiff placed a hand on my shoulder. My body rose because it was told to. As they led me away, I looked back at the room one last time. It was emptying quickly, like a tide pulling away from shore. The silence lingered, heavy, absolute. That was what they had judged me for, silence. The silence of a man who couldn't speak, the silence of a daughter who listened too closely, the silence of a love that could not translate into law. The trial of silence had ended, but the echo of it would go on forever. Time in prison didn't move forward, it thickened, like air turning to syrup. Each day had the same color, the same sound, the same weight pressing on my chest. I had been there long enough for the seasons to change without me noticing. The walls were the same no matter what the calendar said. It was the sameness that hurt the most, not the cold, not the noise, not even the loneliness. It was the unbroken rhythm of existing without living, of breathing without believing that any of it still mattered. When I first arrived, I thought the world had simply stopped, but it hadn't. It had only shrunk to the size of my cell, the width of my bed, the echo of footsteps in the corridor. My body began to remember the routine faster than my mind did. Wake up when the lights snapped on. Eat food that tasted like damp cardboard. Line up. Wait. Return. Sleep under the same thin blanket that never felt warm. There was no distinction between morning and night, only between noise and silence. At first, I tried to mark the days. I drew lines on the underside of my bunk using the stub of a pencil someone had left behind. I thought it would give me a sense of control, that I could still measure time the way I once measured heartbeats. But after a while, the marks stopped meaning anything. Time wasn't something I could count anymore. It was something that counted me. The women around me became shadows moving through the same pattern. Some screamed at night, some prayed, some laughed with the kind of laughter that broke apart in the air before it could reach anyone. I rarely spoke. They called me nurse after someone mentioned what I used to be. It wasn't meant kindly or cruelly. It was just another name, like inmate or Miller. Names were identifiers, not identities. I worked in the infirmary because I couldn't bear to do anything else. It was the closest thing to the world I had left behind, though it was stripped of all dignity. We didn't have real equipment, just a few kits, a drawer of expired bandages, a box of dull scissors. Most of the women came in with bruises, infections, withdrawal. Some came just to sit, to escape their cells for a few quiet minutes. I didn't judge them. I knew what it meant to crave stillness, even if it was surrounded by pain. There was one woman, older, her hair gone almost white from stress. She used to hum when I cleaned her wounds, a low sound that vibrated against the metal cot. She never spoke to me, but I understood her language. It was the same kind my father had used, the language of small sounds, of restrained breaths, of the body saying what words couldn't. Every time I touched her, I remembered the weight of his hand in mine, the warmth fading slowly. The past came back in fragments, light, pressure, scent, not memories, but sensations, unfinished and raw. At night, I lay awake listening to the hum of the ventilation system. It was the closest thing to the rhythm of a heartbeat. I used to count the seconds between each mechanical breath, as if the air itself were alive. There were moments when I thought I could feel his presence in that sound, as though he had found a way to live inside the machines again, keeping me alive now the way I had once kept him. But I knew it was only my mind trying to find meaning in monotony. The guards were indifferent. They weren't cruel, not really. They were simply detached. They saw too much suffering to feel it anymore. I learned quickly how to make myself invisible to them. I followed the rules, kept my eyes low, made no demands. I became part of the background, like the pipes that moaned or the flickering lights that no one bothered to fix. One day, they brought in a young girl, barely 20. She had the kind of trembling in her hands that I recognized immediately. Withdrawal, fear, both. She clung to the edges of the cot like she might fall off the earth if she let go. I held her hand until her breathing slowed, until her eyes stopped darting around. She looked at me as if she couldn't decide whether to hate me or trust me. I didn't tell her what I had done. I didn't tell her why I was here. It didn't matter. In this place, the reasons were irrelevant. Only the consequences were real. The months bled together until the idea of freedom became abstract. People on the outside thought of freedom as movement, as space, as choice. But in here, freedom was something else entirely. It was the ability to stop replaying the past, to stop hearing the echo of the moment when everything changed. Freedom wasn't physical, it was internal, and I didn't have it. I was still trapped inside that room with the machines, with his eyes, with the silence that had swallowed us both. Sometimes, during count, I would place my hand against my chest and feel the dull rhythm beneath my ribs. It felt unfamiliar, as though it belonged to someone else. My heart beat, but I couldn't feel it. It was muscle memory, not emotion. I realized then that I was alive in the most technical sense. My body obeyed biology, but my soul had gone somewhere else. I wondered if that's what he had felt, lying there all those months, listening to machines breathe for him. I wondered if I had simply inherited his stillness. The prison chaplain visited once a week. He always offered to pray with me, but I declined. I didn't need forgiveness from a God who hadn't been in that hospital room. I didn't even need forgiveness from myself. What I wanted was understanding, and that was something even faith couldn't give. He left pamphlets in my cell anyway, verses about mercy, salvation, release. I used them as bookmarks for the medical manual I had found in the infirmary. words of one world holding the pages of another. One evening, there was a power outage. The lights died without warning, and the air filled with the restless movement of bodies shifting in the dark. The hum of the vents stopped. For the first time in months, there was no sound, no machines, no electricity, just the raw breath of women breathing in unison. The quiet was suffocating and sacred all at once. I sat there in the dark and realized how deeply I had depended on mechanical noise to drown out my own thoughts. Without it, I heard everything: the beating of my heart, the faint ringing in my ears, the echo of his last blink. It was unbearable. When the power returned, I almost wept. The hum resumed, steady and relentless, life restored, or something like it. The others groaned, cursed, went back to their routines. But I sat still, the sound vibrating through me like the pulse I no longer trusted. It was a reminder that I existed, that I had not yet become part of the silence. Eventually, I stopped marking days altogether. I stopped trying to measure anything. My world became smaller, but it also became sharper, more defined in its stillness. Every heartbeat, every breath, every echo had weight. The heart without a pulse still beat. It just did so in a language I hadn't learned to hear yet. And in that stillness, I began to sense something I hadn't felt since before the trial. Not hope exactly, but a faint stirring, like the tremor that precedes movement. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. It was life, fragile and strange, reawakening in a place where life wasn't supposed to grow. When they opened the gate, it didn't creak or groan like it did in my imagination. It simply clicked, like a door closing behind me instead of opening ahead. A sound so small it could have been missed, and yet it marked the moment the world outside swallowed me again. I stepped out into sunlight that felt too wide, too loud. The air hit me like a wave of memory, not warmth. I hadn't felt wind on my face in years. It touched my skin like a stranger trying to remember if we once knew each other. There was no one waiting for me. I had known there wouldn't be. No family, no friends, no small welcome home sign awkwardly held by hands, unsure if it was the right thing to do. Just a parole officer, clean shirt, tired eyes, holding out a clipboard with my name typed neatly across the top. I signed it with a hand that didn't feel like mine. That was the first time I wrote my name outside prison walls. It looked foreign in my own handwriting. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I didn't even look back. They say freedom feels like breath, like relief, like joy. To me, it felt like being untethered from gravity, like stepping out of a capsule into a world where nothing could hold me down, but also nothing held me up. I wasn't walking out. I was falling forward. I spent my first night in a halfway house tucked between a pawn shop and a liquor store. The mattress was thin but softer than steel, and the window opened just enough to let in a sliver of sky. I stared through that crack at a single star and waited for silence. But freedom had no silence, not the way prison did. Out here, silence was made of sirens in the distance, dogs barking behind fences, voices behind walls I couldn't see through. Everything was louder than I remembered. Every sound reminded me that I didn't belong in it anymore. I tried to sleep, but my body was too used to hardness, to alarms, to count calls. The quiet was dishonest, slippery. I lay still for hours, my heartbeat thudding against a freedom I hadn't asked for, but now had to carry. In prison, you fight to survive. Out here, you fight to matter. And that's a different kind of sentence. In the morning, I stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom and looked at myself. I saw the lines etched around my mouth, the faint gray at my temples, the eyes that had stopped expecting softness. My reflection blinked at me like she wasn't sure if I was real. I touched my face gently, as if I might smear myself away. That was the thing about freedom. There were no uniforms to hide in, no bars to define the space between who you were and who the world saw. You were raw, visible, bare. I applied for jobs. They all asked the same question. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? I marked yes every time. It didn't matter how I phrased the explanation. Most places didn't call back. Some did, only to politely tell me the position had been filled. Eventually, I found work cleaning an overnight hospice facility. It was quiet, and they didn't ask too many questions. I moved through the halls with a cart of bleach and gloves, scrubbing away the remnants of lives just recently ended. It felt familiar, like I was still speaking the same language, just in reverse. Some nights I sat beside the dying, not because it was part of my job, but because they looked like him, still, silent, waiting. I listened to their breath, watched the shape of their mouths, held their hands when the machines beeped slower and slower. Sometimes they blinked. Once, one of them blinked twice, just once, and I had to leave the room. I went into the supply closet and cried into the sleeve of my shirt, biting down on the fabric to stay quiet. I knew it was coincidence. I knew it meant nothing, but it also meant everything. I kept writing. At night, in the margins of junk mail, on the backs of receipts, I wrote him letters. I wrote to the man who had raised me, who had once carried me on his shoulders, who had asked me to help him leave with dignity. I wrote because I still didn't know how to speak about it out loud. I wrote because no one had ever truly asked me why. The courts had asked what and when and how, but not why. Why is always the question no one wants the real answer to. The people I passed in the street didn't know what I had done. They saw a woman walking quickly, eyes forward, shoulders low. They saw someone who looked tired but normal. Only I knew the quiet I carried inside, the heavy silence that had once held a heartbeat. I wasn't haunted, not exactly. I was accompanied. There's a difference. Ghosts wail. This presence merely stayed beside me, constant, familiar, like a shadow that doesn't move even when the light does. One afternoon, I stood in line at the grocery store behind a mother and her young son. He was asking questions in that endless way children do. What's this? What's that? Why does bread have holes? Why is the man sad? His mother hushed him gently. I didn't know what answer she gave. I only knew that I didn't want to disappear from people anymore. I wanted to be seen again, not as an ex-inmate, not as the woman who took the machines away, but as someone who had done something unbearable out of unbearable love. That was all. So I volunteered at a clinic. Just a few hours, filing papers, folding pamphlets. They didn't ask for references, just willingness. They were short-staffed and tired, the kind of people who recognized quiet desperation and didn't flinch at it. There was a comfort in that, a kind of permission to exist without explanation. Freedom didn't come in grand gestures. It came in small, almost imperceptible shifts. The first time someone said, "Thank you," and meant it. The first time I laughed without guilt. The first time I slept a full night without dreaming of the hospital room. The first time I looked in the mirror and saw someone I could forgive. I kept a small notebook in my pocket where I wrote down every blink I witnessed in others. People blink all the time without thinking, but I noticed them all. Every twitch, every flinch, every subtle contraction of grief or fatigue or thought. It became my secret ritual, my way of remembering that language still existed between the lines. That consent, trust, sorrow, they lived in silence, in eyes, in everything that goes unspoken. I never stopped missing him. I never stopped wondering if I'd made the right choice, but I also never stopped believing that, in that room, in that moment, it was the only choice that honored who he had been. A man who ran into burning buildings, a man who taught me courage by example, not by lecture, a man who blinked twice and trusted me to understand what that meant. I learned to live in a world that never heard him. I learned to walk through it with the knowledge that some truths don't need to be shouted. Some are carried quietly, with every step, every breath, every blink. Freedom, for me, would never be loud. It would never be celebrated. It would never be clean. It was not a parade, not a homecoming, not a song. It was this, walking forward with a heart stitched back together from silence, carrying the memory of his eyes, and never needing to explain it again.